I start just about every morning with a to-do list. Usually, if I'm being honest, it's an overly ambitious to-do list, usually scribbled on a post-it note in the corner of my desk. One of the things that is always on the list, but that often goes unchecked at the end of the day, is making time for writing. Being a writer, making a daily practice of it is important to me, but I struggle to do it. I don't know why. It's not that I'm not dedicated. I'm so dedicated that, in fact, I put it on the list every day. And I'm so dedicated that every day I gather quotes and prompts and story ideas so that I'll have lots of inspiration when I do write. I'm so dedicated that every day I work on other things and finish other pressing commitments so that eventually I'll have lots of time to write. I'm so dedicated that surely one of these days I'll start writing. One of my favorite authors, Anne Lamott, talks about this, about how hard it is, in fact, to just sit down every day and put your butt in the chair and write. She says, the discouraging voices will hound you. This is all piffle, they will say, and they might be right. What you are doing may just be practice, but this is how you're going to get better. Some of the best writing advice I ever got was from a workshop teacher who once told me, take a few minutes and for now, don't write, but just, write what you would write if you were going to write. I sometimes feel like in all the years since I've gotten that advice, I haven't written anything since, but I have written a lot about what I would write if I did. You might call this the practice of practicing, learning how to practice. The problem is that the finished product we might imagine for ourselves can feel too far from where we're starting. The person we would like ourselves to be can feel so far from the person we wake up with every morning, and the world as we would like it to be, well, that can feel impossibly far from the world we read about in the headlines every day. The demons of perfectionism stand in the way of writing just as they stand in the way of creative risk-taking in general, which is unfortunate because we know that creating something new, creating a life for yourself that doesn't yet exist, requires some creative risk-taking. Showing up as your best self even requires setting aside those discouraging voices that hound us. And so often, just imagining a world of true justice and equity and compassion, just imagining it can mean fighting those voices that show up to say your efforts are just piffle. When the demons of perfectionism show up like this, I try to practice the practicing of showing up for myself and for others. Musicians know something about practicing. One of the requirements for all students at Berklee College of Music, where I attended years ago, is 4 semesters of ear training. Central to the curriculum, ear training is learning to sight sing music just by reading the notes on a page, and learning to write down the notes and transcribe music just by listening to it. Now, when I began school, I knew that there certainly were people who were capable of this kind of magic, but it seemed like some kind of Harry Potter nonsense to me. Like, you might as well ask me to turn my desk into a toad using a conductor's baton. I remember the first day of ear training class vividly. There was a sort of nervous silence among us students. Well, silence except for one student who was quite vocal in his nervousness. There was one student who interrupted the teacher in the first few minutes of the very first class to share that he was worried the class was going to be too advanced for him. He wanted to make it clear that he knew not a single thing about ear training. The teacher kindly paused his introductions and responded. He explained that we'd all taken entrance exams, and he was sure we'd all been placed in the appropriate class. The teacher tried to continue, but was interrupted again. Well, the man stopped him. Is this the very lowest class, though? Because I need to be in like the very lowest class. Now, at this point, you could tell the teacher got a little embarrassed. He looked around the room a little sheepishly, not really wanting to debate this guy, but he also didn't want to explain that we were, in fact, a class of the most basic students in the school. Well, he said it is ear training 101, so I guess it is the lowest. There is a class, I guess, for people that have previously failed the 101, but you all are just about the lowest. Now, some of the other students in the class giggled a little bit at this point, kind of laughing at this man's anxieties. But I was kind of glad to hear that someone was questioning what felt to me like the absurd notion that sight singing even could be taught. I don't know what happened next for that student, but he never came back to our class after that. Not because anything we did on that first day was in fact too difficult for him, I'm sure of that. But I think he just didn't believe that improvement was even possible. I kept going, thinking that if generations of music students have done this before, it must be possible somehow, even though I personally can't see the way forward. And I made a commitment to at least practice the material. I've always remembered this other student, though, who gave up before he started. It's not just that he didn't try to become a master at ear training. It's that he didn't even try the practicing of it, which always struck me as the real loss. When the discouraging voices hound me, I think of him sometimes, and I remind myself that maybe for now, the work I'm doing is just practice. But practice is how I'm going to get better. This pandemic arrived nearly a year ago, and it has been a difficult year, to be sure. A time of the ground shifting beneath us constantly. I imagine that the next year, like the past one, will be a time of relearning new ways of being together all over again, of organizing our days differently all over again, of organizing our people differently all over again. This is a time of adaptation, and it is also a time of imagination. This has been a year, and I hope it will continue to be so, for a time of calling on those in power, which in some ways is all of us, to learn to play some different roles and learn some new skills. I think particularly for white folks, as we see so vividly white supremacy in our country and in our communities, all over the headlines, rising up and rearing its ugly head. This is a time particularly for white people to practice some new ways of being in our communities. For listening in deeper ways we haven't always done so well before, and having some hard conversations we haven't yet practiced enough. Fellow white folks, when you hear people of color making demands, imagining new ways of structuring this society, now is a time to practice amplifying those voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. If you've inherited wealth that was accumulated in a time of systematic racial segregation, which is true of all wealth in this country, now is the time to practice giving it away. If your muscle memory has been to call the police when something goes wrong, now is the time to practice something different. I won't all of a sudden do all of these things myself, but I will practice the doing of them at least. Musicians know that muscle memory is very real. We know that consistent practicing changes the very structures of our brains. It rewires our circuitry, forging new connections and new possibilities. No one is born a musician. Musicians are just the ones that learned how to practice. Even songbirds need elder birds to sing to them and teach them their melodies. Practice doesn't make music perfect. It makes music possible. And so let us practice the practicing, showing up for ourselves and for each other to build that new world of justice and equity and compassion. Practice won't make the world perfect. Someday I want to be a true expert in justice and compassion, Someday I want to be well practiced at creating that brave space, even when there's no such thing as safe space. Someday I want to be masterful at amplifying the voices that fight to be heard elsewhere, and I want to be skillful at speaking more truth and more love. Someday I hope to be part of transforming our so-called justice system that has hurt so many so deeply. Someday I want to be part of shifting our education system that fast tracks some to college and others to prison. Someday I want to be part of transforming our energy sector that's been working overtime to overheat our planet. These are daunting tasks, to be sure. On most days, learning to transcribe a symphony by ear seems more manageable than any one of them. But that's okay, because for now, I don't have to do all those things. I just need to practice doing what I would do if I were doing them. So dear ones, don't promise to be your best self today. Just be the person you would be if you were practicing being your best self. Don't try to rebuild a new world in the image of love this week. Just practice doing what you would do if you had committed to such things. You have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We all have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. So let us start together, let us grow together, and let us practice together. Our hymn of reflection this morning is More Waters Rising by Sarah Lynch Thomason, a climate justice activist in Appalachia. This song, like I think the best music, and perhaps like the best faith communities, calls us not to turn away from the difficult things, not to ignore the crises of our time, which are very real, but to name them honestly and to face them directly and to move forward to address them together. I invite you to remain muted, but sing along at home. Now is a great time to practice some new harmonies you might not have been so bold to try if others could hear you. There are more waters rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more waters rising, they will find their way to me. There are more waters rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know. There are more fires burning, they will find their way to me. There are more fires burning, this I know, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know. There are more mountains falling, this I know, this I know. There are more mountains falling, this I know. There are more mountains falling, they will find their way to me. There are more mountains falling, this I know, this I know. There are more mountains falling, this I know. I will wade through the waters, this I know, this I know. I will wade through the waters, this I know. I will wade through the waters when they find their way to me. I will wade through the waters, this I know, this I know. I will wade through the waters, this I know. I will walk through the fire, this I know, this I know. I will walk through the fires, this I know. I will walk through the fires when they find their way to walk through the fires, this I know. I will rebuild the mountains, this I know. This I know. I will rebuild the mountains, this I know. I will rebuild the mountains when they find their way to me. I will rebuild the mountains, this I know. This I know. I will rebuild the mountains, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. This I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more waters rising, they will find their way to me. There are more waters rising, this I know. This I know. There are more waters rising, this I know.